Good morning and welcome to the Relationship, Sex and Health Education webinar for pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. I'm Rob Simpson, I'm the Programme Director for RSHE at the Department for Education. I understand that we have almost 4,000 people registered for this event, which I think underlines the interest in how important it is to make sure relationships in sex and health education is accessible to pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. We know that as young people progress into adulthood, these young people are more likely to suffer with mental health and physical health issues and could be more likely to be abused as well. So getting it right now means that we can make a real difference in their life outcomes. The agenda is arranged so you'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of every presentation. But we won't be able to answer every question, unfortunately, because of the numbers that will be coming in. So we will publish a Q&A alongside the live version of the webinar on the PSHE Association website in the coming weeks. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the question box below the player. The presentations after the webinar will be available, so if you'd like to complete the evaluation form, you can get access to those. Please feel free to fill in the evaluation and send it to us so we can know that you're interested in other SEND specific events in the future and other topics of your interest. We do have quite a tight agenda, and we have built in a comfort break at 10:55 for 10 minutes to help with that. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Ian Balcom, the department's education advisor and CEO of the Tenax School Trust. Ian.
Good morning, everyone. As Rob said, my name is Ian Balcom. By background, I'm a head teacher and teacher. I currently lead a group of schools, primary and secondary, including specialist primary SEND provision in Kent and Sussex. And as Rob said, I've been working with the DFE over the past 3 years, advising on RSHE. Just allow me to add my welcome to all participants in this conference this morning. I hope you find it a worthwhile and interesting event. So moving on to the first main slide then. As we plan for the implementation of RSHE in schools from September this year, it is of critical importance that we remember that the requirements for a good curriculum in these areas applies to all pupils, including those with SEND of whatever type, and whether they're educated in mainstream settings or in specialist provision. It's worth looking briefly at the starting points the statutory guidance sets out for RSHE and SEND. We need to plan for our curriculum to be accessible for all pupils. The delivery of the planned curriculum will clearly need to be differentiated and personalised to meet the needs of all pupils. When thinking about what those needs are, they will of course vary significantly by context, but we have to be aware that some pupils with SEND are very vulnerable to exploitation and to bullying, and where we can reduce those risks for them by a good RSHE curriculum, we must take that opportunity. For many children and young people with SEND, in particular, but not exclusively, in specialist provision, these subjects are already and will certainly continue to be a core part of their curriculum. That is because when they are bespoke to needs, they can support things like emotional development, mental health, relationship forming and sustaining, and safeguarding. It's worth noting that the statutory guidance is not intended to be a scheme of work. It's a summary of core content that points towards a scheme of delivery. That scheme of delivery can only really be designed by teachers with their own pupils in mind. And every school and teacher must take the headlines, the content outcomes in the statutory guidance, and decide whether, how, and when to teach to their own pupils whose needs they know best. The topics taught in RSHE, such as health, hygiene, friends, relationship can be built on and included as outcomes also in education, health and care plans. So moving on to the next slide then, bearing in mind that the statutory guidance is clear that RSHE must be made accessible to all pupils, it is important to give thought to how this is best achieved. This presents challenges in many areas, not only in SEND. There is certainly no one-size-fits-all approach to catering for pupils with SEND, not least because that very term covers such a broad range of need. We are all familiar, of course, with the main categories that are used, but these can be useful, I think, in helping us to organise our thinking and planning. But I think most SEND teachers and experts would say that it's important not to devote most of our time to trying to categorise pupils according to type, but rather to focus on the needs of the individual young people and try to meet them as flexibly as we can. I've already said that the statutory guidance is in no way intended to be a scheme of work for delivery, and there is considerable licence for flexibility. It's probably important to be clear that content listed for primary and secondary is also intended to be understood flexibly for all pupils, in particular those with SEND. It may be that there are aspects of content which the needs of the pupils suggest should be taught in a phase other than where they appear in the statutory guidance. That is a decision for teachers, and teachers are empowered to take it. So if you consider, for example, that content envisaged for secondary is actually needed by younger pupils whom you're teaching, then plan to teach it. And likewise, if you consider that secondary age pupils you work for need more reinforcement of primary content before they move on to secondary a bit later, then that will be the right thing for you to do for your pupils. Moving on then to safeguarding and relationships on the next slide, I just wanted to comment specifically on 3 key priorities that I've grouped here under this heading of safeguarding and relationships. These are by no means the only areas to focus on, but I did just want to comment on these 3 specifically. For some people, for some young people with SEND, there is absolutely a need to support their understanding of what a healthy, mutually supportive relationship actually is. Just to bring a small personal anecdote into this for a moment, a week or so ago, I was talking to a friend of mine whose now adult daughter, whom I taught many years ago, has a Prader-Willi syndrome, which is a complex genetic disorder which brings incomplete sexual development and emotional and social immaturity. And she described to me how throughout her daughter's teenage and adult life, she's struggled to see when she is being exploited, sadly, usually by unscrupulous men for money or sex or both. And that conversation just really brought home to me as I was reflecting on this upcoming conference, just how much intensive support young people need right from the beginning to see the differences between genuine friendships and relationships which are one-way and exploitative. And that is because of the importance of friendships and intimate relationships, I think, in all our lives, including of those young people with SEND. We want our young people to have fulfilled and happy lives, and relationships are an essential part for the vast majority of people for that to happen. Most young people with SEND are very much sexual beings, and talking about their sexual feelings and preparing them with the judgment and self-knowledge they need to form intimate relationships which lead to happiness and human flourishing must surely be a core part of what these subjects are about. Just moving on to comment briefly on health education on the next slide. I just wanted to observe how important it is to look at the topic of health education through the prism of young people with SEND and reflects on how critical and central that content is. Drawing out just a few highlights, the emphasis on mental well-being, which we have in health education, is critical. We know how many pupils with SEND, for example, have low feelings of self-worth and can be vulnerable to bullying, as I've said already, all of which can lead to mental health problems such as anxiety, depression, and more. The best kind of teaching and mentoring and supportive interaction can help young people to become aware of mental well-being as a thing which can be described and monitored, and that helps them potentially to know when they might need help and indeed to avoid some of the triggers for them for mental ill health. No less important, of course, is physical health. All the evidence tells us that many pupils with SEND are at increased risk in later life from poor health outcomes. They may be less likely to exercise, more likely to suffer from obesity, experience mental health problems, or die prematurely. As far as possible, early habits and knowledge of things like healthy eating and regular exercise can help to mitigate some of these difficulties, as can strong teaching on the dangers and risks of the various dependencies which they may be at risk from, for example, in the form of drugs, alcohol, or smoking. Many young people also, of course, require particular support as they enter puberty, and that is also an aspect of health education. So just moving on to my last slide to bring us right up to date with the situation we find ourselves in now. The coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic does have the potential, unfortunately, to affect disproportionately children and young people with SEND, and that's through disruption to their usual routine and a reduction in access to education, health, and care supports, which they rely on often so heavily. Although schools have been open to vulnerable children, including those with education, health, and care plans, actually, as of the beginning of June, only 15% of pupils with EHC plans were in attendance. And so that brings home to all of us, I think, just how much education and routine and support will have been missed by many of these young people when they return to us in the autumn. And this period of closure has put enormous additional pressure on many parents, families, and carers who will want or need to support their children at home. A few statistics to illustrate that. A survey of 4,000 parents and carers by the Disabled Children's Partnership saw a 76% reduction in short respite breaks being able to be taken by parents and carers, and 68% said that non-disabled siblings were providing care. 70 to 80% reported worsening mental and physical health for themselves and their disabled child. So that's just an illustration of some of the pressures that many of these families have been living through. As pupils return to school, teachers will obviously need to find ways of re-engaging pupils with SEND and helping them to re-establish friendships whilst obviously observing appropriate COVID protection measures. As teachers, many of you will recognise this process and recognise also that it may be different and take longer than it will for mainstream peers. And the learning loss, understood there in its broadest sense, may be significantly greater than for mainstream pupils. I hope you will find that the RSHE curriculum or the RHE curriculum in primary schools provides you with a good structure to help you think about supporting pupils back into their learning while addressing some of the needs that they will be facing in the autumn. Thank you very much for your attention. Rob, back to you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for that really informative introduction to this event. We do have some time for questions, so we've got about 15 minutes. So as the technology runs through, we'll get those questions listed and then be able to ask those, and I will ask them on behalf of the individuals placing the questions. So the first question we have is, how can you differentiate RSHE provision when there are so many different types of need?
Yes, this is a problem that many teachers and educators will be facing. I think the answer to the question depends very much on context. If you're fortunate enough to be working in a specialist context where you have relatively small groups, often albeit of children with very high needs, and potentially other adults in the class, then it is possible to identify and understand the needs of individual pupils in some depth. And cater for them, adapt your learning with the support of other adults in the room to support them. It's much harder, clearly, if you have a large class with a broad range of needs and very little other adult support in the room. I think in those circumstances, you probably do have to cover a broad base in your planning, identify the areas that you think most of the people in your classroom are likely to be facing, and then work with pupils as time and capacity allows individually to unpack that and adapt it to their own needs. I think also giving time for questions and discussion in class, even in the context of a larger class, can be very helpful because it helps you as the educator to deepen your understanding of what's on children's minds.
Thank you, Ian, for that answer. We have a few more questions coming through. The next question is, many of our feeder primary schools have been unable to do RSE with their year 6 pupils due to school closures. Do you recommend that we aim to consolidate and integrate it with the planned work for year 7s, or teach it as a whole primary based unit?
I think that's a really good and timely question, and lots of schools are thinking about the curriculum from September. In the case of secondary schools, so whether they're mainstream or specialist provision secondary schools, understanding the depth and coverage of the curriculum that primary pupils in year 6 will have had is important. I have to say it will vary from school to school, and we have heard very good examples of primary schools being able to continue some aspects of relationships and health education, or PSHE as they will often call it, in year 6. So in those cases there will be less catching up to do, but of course many large secondary schools draw pupils from a wide variety of primary schools, and it's likely that provision will be varied across any large sample of primary schools. So I think going back to the primary content and drawing out some of the key essentials, the key must-haves rather than nice-to-haves, and making sure that they're front and centre at the beginning of year 7 is critical. There will be things, particularly that come from health education, that I think are particularly relevant to the situation that we find ourselves in now. On the physical side, obviously to do with disease transmission, hygiene, germs, bacteria and viruses, and how those can be minimized, and making sure that those messages are properly understood by all children, including those with SEND. And then more on the mental well-being side, picking up and understanding some of those risks that children may have been facing and have brought back into school with them during the lockdown, to do with anxiety about what's been going on. And bear in mind that some children with SEND will just need more time and support to understand what the pandemic actually has been, what it's meant, why they've been living through this unusual period that they have been living through. So that's a long way of saying, yes, adapt your year 7 curriculum, try to find out from your primaries, if you can, what they have done. It is a mixed picture, but you will probably need to adapt.
Thank you. One of the questions, there's been quite a few people actually placing a question of this nature, and that is, with respect to the delay or the flexibility in teaching the new syllabus until the start of the summer 2021. So the question is, we were in the middle of communicating with our parents when lockdown occurred. Does our policy need to be on the school website for September? Obviously, this needs to be produced in conjunction with parents. As a special school, our parents are busy focusing on where they are now without having to worry about this issue for next term, especially remotely. And they were just asking more generally whether or not some advice can be given about how we manage that particular situation in terms of engagement with parents.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is a challenge that policymakers have been very alive to in the last couple of months as we've lived through lockdown. Clearly, many schools have found it challenging to conduct a formal consultation or indeed more informal levels of engagement with parents on this issue. To that end, what the government has effectively permitted is a slightly softer launch of the statutory requirements to teach RHE and RSHE from September. So the formal requirement is still in place for September, but schools have been given until April 2021 to effectively get their ducks lined up. So getting the policy is still an important thing to do. Getting it consulted on and agreed and on the website is still important, but there is no absolute obligation to have that in place from the beginning of term in the autumn. You have got a bit longer to get that sorted out. What we're saying is that schools should be teaching, they should have done their planning, got their policy ready, got it on their website, and be teaching the new subjects by April onwards of 2021. So effectively, the lead-in period has been softened and lengthened across the two terms, the autumn term 2020 and the spring term 2021, to make it a bit easier to manage. And I'll just offer some reassurance that Ofsted are also aware of this and are completely on board with this approach. So you do have longer to get your ducks in a row, if I can use that expression. Hope that answers the question, Rob.
Thank you, Ian. There is a related one, actually, from an individual who says they have been delivering a comprehensive RSE curriculum at their school for many years, so probably under the PSHE banner. How far do we need to take parental consultation process? And I think the genesis for the question is, we have so far sent information letters out with the government leaflet for parents and an invitation to read the updated policy and to feedback. So I think the question is more around, as they've already been delivering PSHE or an RSE curriculum, how far does that consultation process need to go?
Yes, and this will particularly apply to many specialist provision schools, although also to some mainstream schools, because for them, these subjects have been central to the curriculum for many years. There is no prescribed way of undertaking consultation, and deliberately so, because the level and depth and range of consultation will vary from school to school. And I think in a school which has already got a well-developed programme that largely or possibly even entirely meets the new statutory requirements, it may be that parents are already fully on board and fully engaged. So I would suggest that in circumstances like that, the consultation justifiably could probably be pretty light touch. It might, for example, be a draft revised policy which is offered to parents for comment before it's finalised by the school's governing board. If that policy doesn't really contain anything that's significantly different from what the school has been doing for a long time, it may be sufficient simply to take comments from parents on the key points of the policy, rather than engaging in a very active and detailed approach to consultation, which would be more appropriate in a school where some more significant differences were being proposed from the former state of affairs to the delivery of the new subjects. So the detail and depth of the consultation is entirely for schools to determine according to their own context.
Thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more question then. One of the questions which have come in is in relation to how SRE or RSE, as we would call it, be adapted specifically for SEN pupils in a mainstream setting where they have significant learning difficulties impacting their maturity and understanding. So I guess in relation to their developmental and cognitive abilities. I know that we have talked about age appropriateness. I guess this is looking more at the developmental sensitivities around teaching of RSE.
Yes, I mean, I think for children educated in the mainstream who have got very significant cognitive challenges in comparison with their peers, it's probably important to think about RSHE in a similar way to ways in which we think about other subjects. I mean, what would a teacher of English do if they had a child with very significant literacy delays in their class and other children in that class didn't have that significant delay? It may be that it's possible to provide appropriate in-class differentiation, possibly using the support of other adults in the class. It may be that some core content can be delivered in lesson, and then the support of SEND experts outside the lesson can further reinforce it, give children further opportunity to unpack it, break it down, talk through the issues outside the context of the mainstream class. Really depends on what the approach of the school is to organising classes and access to mainstream lessons for children with very significant cognitive challenges. So hope that goes some way to answering the question.
Thank you. So I think those were pretty much all of the questions which have come through. There was one other, if I may, specifically looking at this area, and that was, and again, it relates, I think, to your previous answer, but how do you know pupils understand what they have been taught? And I think that's sort of in relation to their cognitive ability, developmental awareness, and of course, age appropriateness. And this could be cognitive age as well as actual age.
So how do you know they've understood and learnt what you intended to teach them? I think the answer to that effectively is probably through conversation and questioning. I think teachers who can observe children, for example, talking about some content that you've taught to them, you can ask them appropriately probing questions about it. So, do you think it would be different if this rather than this had happened? Just tell me again what you think the risks are, or tell me why you've chosen this course of action rather than this course of action. So that's effectively what most teachers would call formative in-class assessment. And that kind of formative assessment that gives teachers a very kind of real-time feedback on the way children are thinking can be a really useful source of information to allow teachers then to decide what needs to be further reinforced, what needs to be re-explained, where further examples or worked examples are needed to support children.
Thank you, Ian. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in terms of this particular questioning session. So thank you again for the introduction to the event, very informative, and for your highly informative responses to the questions asked. We'll now move on with the event, and I would like to introduce Professor Barry Carpenter. He is the Professor of Mental Health in Education in England, the first professor, should I say, and has been a head teacher at 3 schools and has extensive knowledge and experience of special educational needs. So I'd like to hand over now then to Professor Barry Carpenter.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning, everyone. Can I thank the DFE particularly for providing this opportunity for those of us working in the SEND community to specifically focus on this very, very important area of work, Particular thanks to Nikki Chowdhury, who's worked so hard to pull all of this together and who delivers all of this with great passion and insight. So thank you, Nikki. And I think it's really timely that there is this change with the word relationships preceding some of the other components. We couldn't have known, the DFE could not have known when they're preparing all of this, that we were going to go through a pandemic, that this whole document, as Ian was saying in that very helpful introduction, that the dimensions of health, of hygiene, of friendships, of relationships, those are going to be so key to our work as we bring our children with special educational needs and disabilities back into whatever educational setting they find themselves, whether that be a special school, a mainstream school, a specialist provision, or pupil referral unit and alternative provision. Relationships are going to be absolutely key to restoring our children's mental health post-pandemic and even during this pandemic, and key to our practice. Let me just analyse what I'm meaning by the title I've given you for this session. Let's work backwards. When we talk mental health, to be honest, colleagues, we often talk about mental ill health. So really, I would like us to think more of talking about mental wealth. How do we make our children emotionally strong, emotionally resilient? And which is why the front of my title talks about going from those powerful relationships that children with special needs inevitably have with you as their educators, through to building that resilience. And if we are mindful of the fact that they have been through a time that's been uncomfortable for them, as it has been for all children, as it has been for all of us, that we will need to regenerate that mental health of our children and young people with special needs. But I think taking an approach of mental wealth, and mental wealth is about treasure. Colleagues, you have treasure in your hands. Treasure that if you invested wisely, you can transform the lives of the most vulnerable children in our society and in our schools. As Bruce Perry says, the more healthy relationships a child has, the more they will recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agent of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. Let's explore that through this presentation. Next slide, please. So I want to make sure we've got a clear grip on mental health. It's not been our background as a teaching profession. None of us have ever been probably trained in any depth. We've got some wonderful initiatives now like Mental Health First Aid and the training for mental health leads. But it's a new in-depth area for our work in schools, very timely and very necessary. We need to move our curriculum to reflect the needs of our children. And I've taken this quote from the work that I did when I was National Director for the DFE's own project on children with complex needs. And what we discovered in that project, which took place across every type of school setting in the UK that had children with special needs in it and was internationally corroborated as well, we discovered that in fact of all the complex needs emergent in this new generation of children in this 21st century, mental health was the one that would co-occur, that would creep up and cohabit with any other special need. It's very obvious in children with autism, for example. We know that probably between 60 and 70% of children with autism with the onset of adolescence will develop a mental health issue. All of that hormonal raging in adolescence is incompatible with the responses normally given by the child with autism. So we have a fact there that mental health is extremely prevalent, mental ill health is extremely prevalent in our population of children with special needs and disabilities. Next slide, please. And the UN, in the Article 24 on the rights of the child, talks about health, and that's a key component of RSHE. But they acknowledge too that mental health is of overriding importance. You see, a child of any ability can have good health, but if their mental health erodes, if it breaks during childhood and adolescence, then what are the learning gains going to be for that child, young person? How are we going to fulfill that requirement of the Education Reform Act 1988 of preparation for adulthood? it's going to be a very difficult task. So the rights of the child with special needs to have good mental health, to have teaching that reflects a desire to make them emotionally strong. And I think our recovery learning processes as children return to school will focus on restoring those rights. With children with special needs, we know that their emotional well-being may be more compromised, and good mental health is key to good physical health. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you a definition of mental health. There are many. I just like this one from our Mental Health Foundation. And if you want a fuller discussion around this, I refer you there to a podcast that I made for Mental Health Awareness Week, which was just a month ago. And this talks about that positive sense of well-being, and it talks about meeting the demands of everyday life. People in good mental health have the ability to recover effectively from illness, change and misfortune. Colleagues, bad stuff happens in life. That is just life. And we talk about when those bad times, maybe grief or relationship worries or financial concerns, when they hit us, we talk about pulling on our inner strength to get us through those difficult times. I'm sure all of us have had to pull on our inner strength to get us through this pandemic. There have been excessive demands on all of us that are against our natural flow of social interaction and living in a society. But something like inner strength is a terribly abstract concept for some of our young people, particularly those with autism or those with cognitive disabilities. So in a little while, I shall show you some practical ways of thinking about that notion of inner strength. But for our dialogue today, I want to give and offer that as a definition. Moving to the next slide. So thinking then of our population of children with special needs, this is from the Office of National Statistics. And what this tells you is for every 5 children on the SEN register of your school or on the register of a special school, 3 will develop a mental health issue, anxiety, depression, etc. So we know that the mental health of our children with special needs is more fragile. Their vulnerability makes them more prone to mental ill health, and again, particularly with the onset of adolescence. So if we go to the next slide, Ian's already mentioned the impact that this pandemic may have on our children's mental health. And I think this statistic, which is fairly recent, June this year, from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, interestingly, has pointed out that there's probably been a worsening of mental health in the region of 8.1%, particularly in young adults, and it's more than doubled for young women. And how many of those young women are, for example, girls with autism, who have found this a very challenging time? Already we're getting primary schools talking about an increase in self-harm in Year 6 girls that have returned to school. Not a phenomena you'd usually expect in the primary sector. Next slide, please. Again, Ian referred to social, emotional, mental health. So we have now, from within the code of practice, this as a focus for children, particularly with education, health and care plans. So already the planning of how we articulate this area into learning goals for children and young people with special needs is already happening. Already we've begun to break that tradition of not knowing how to work in this area and discover effective educational practices that will support this area of work, that will take on a new significance again once the recommendations of the Rochford Review, which are now, the department has them prepared in legislation, but getting anything through pandemic legislation or Brexit legislation is quite tough at the moment. But that is the intention of the department, to implement those, and social emotional mental health will then have a further importance in the curriculum. But again, I'd say it's not an area in which we've traditionally been trained. It's certainly not been an element of teacher training. That's been one of the things we've been working on at Brooks, is to thread that through teacher training at all levels, from undergraduate to masters to doctorate level. Moving to the next slide, I want to focus on the definition, because I think this is quite a dynamic and really pertinent definition. And I've highlighted parts of it to reflect, I think, the current context. Firstly, though, I want to notice that this is a DFE and a Department of Health joint definition signed off by both Secretaries of State at that time. And I think increasingly in our dialogue with our colleagues in health, who are going to be utterly overwhelmed by what has happened during this pandemic. I know of CAM services already who are talking about a doubling of their referral rates. So in the middle of this definition here, particular attention to anxiety, depression, self-harm. The Department of Health reported that in 2017, those three actually doubled in our schools. In fact, in some instances, tripled. And eating disorders. We know that, for example, in girls with autism, an eating disorder is often a first step to leading to a middle childhood, adolescent diagnosis of that girl with autism. And if you look at the end of this definition, I think it's really refreshing that ADD and ADHD get some attention, because the latest research, particularly that coming through from the ADHD Foundation, is shifting our focus of thinking of ADHD as a behaviour management issue to recognising that it is actually a cognitive impairment. That impulsivity that we see as an output of the child with a diagnosis of ADHD is actually a malfunction that's happening probably within the frontal cortex of the brain. So this definition, why I'm sharing it now, it gives us very solid ground, legal solid ground for our practice, and what we're now being offered with RSHE are actually dynamic curriculum routes to bring some of this to life in terms of teaching and learning in schools. The next slide actually particularly focuses on depression, and some of you have heard me talk before will know I've used this mercilessly since my two colleagues in Austria produced this work in 2008. I've used it because it was telling us what would be happening, that depression would become the most prevalent childhood disorder, and without meaning to make a pun, how sad is that? And Britain has already achieved that. Before 2020, we had achieved that. And this sadness, this depression is robbing our children of the joy of childhood. And I wonder to what degree this pandemic has compounded some of that. Next slide. I was asked specifically to mention suicide because it's now the largest cause of death in under 20-year-olds. It's a particular worry in some of our children and young people with autism. It's on the rise. It would currently be 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 10 boys who are self-harming. And remember, self-harm is one step away from suicide. So if we have children returning post-pandemic who have been experiencing self-harm while they've been off from school, then some very sharp interventions need to be put in place. And I'd commend to you some of the work of Dr. Tina Ray, who's written extensively on this with very practical lesson plans and activities about emotional resilience to militate against the effects of self-harming. Next slide. So one of the consequences, I think, of the current situation we find ourselves in will be a rise in anxiety in some of our children and young people. That's naturally there with some of our young people, particularly those with autism with the onset of adolescence. But let's just remind ourselves what's actually happening when the child is anxious. And this is very much based on the work of Professor Uta Frith, that when the child is anxious, the cortisol levels in the brain rise. Now, we all need a bit of cortisol to get us going in the morning, but if the cortisol rises to the surface of the brain, it will actually prevent the memory imprint on the brain. Now, that could represent itself in a child who's sitting meekly in your lesson, but is actually rigid with fear. And some children returning to school may find the new dynamics of having to move around the school in particular ways, to have socially distanced desks and workstations in their classrooms. They could find it quite frightening, and yet you are just operating to keep them as safe as possible. But this environment that they're presented with is not their old normality. The mental image they had of their classroom and of their school has been confronted with the way you've had to present their school, and that will be disturbing for some of our children and young people. So we need work to establish those bonds of trust again. I do worry for the children in Leicestershire who went back to school and then within a few weeks are told to go home again. We were just starting to rebuild those bonds of trust, and again they've had to be broken of necessity to keep everyone safe. But we have to just be mindful of the impact of these things on our children and young people. Next slide, please. All of that means that the anxious child is not a learning child. And I just think this picture reminds us that our children, when they come back, will need space. Some will need to have regular exercise breaks out of the classroom, just a walk, to keep them focused on the activities you're presenting. Some will just need quiet spaces to revert to compose themselves, to self-regulate. And those of you who know the work of the recovery curriculum know that space is one of the 5 levers of learning. Next slide, please. So the question I'm asking really is, how do we keep our children and young people emotionally strong? How do we keep them emotionally strong? And that's about resilience. And here in this picture, I'm being quite deliberate. Do think of physical exercise. Do think of exercises, activities that involve imitation. I haven't enough time here to talk about it, but I've just finished a school-based study where we've discovered that, particularly for children with attachment issues, imitation, which after all is the foundation of all learning, is one of the best ways of stimulating new neural pathway growth in the brain. And indeed, I think could reactivate some of the neural pathways that may have experienced fear and anxiety during this time of lockdown. There are a whole range of resources that will explore this if you go to the Recovery Curriculum website, which is on that slide. Next slide, please. So I talked earlier about mental wealth, and I haven't time to go through the goals here, but if I just give you the last one of these goals, that identity and self-worth, mental wealth is about making our children emotionally strong, as the title of this presentation has said. Attachment is really crucial. And for some of our children, because of their cognitive impairments, may have felt quite abandoned on the day that their school closed, on the day that it was suggested to them that they went home and their school went into lockdown. Remember that when a child is securely attached, they're going to be more curious, they're going to achieve more academically, they're going to be calmer, they can self-regulate their emotions, higher self-esteem, more self-confident. So it's worth thinking about, how do we keep our children and young people emotionally strong? What are the goals of mental wealth? Next slide. And quite simply, this boils down to 2 things, colleagues. What makes us happy and what makes us sad? And it's the ability to use what makes us happy to self-regulate when we're sad. And again, it goes back to my earlier point about inner strength, which I think is an abstract concept for some of our children and young people with special needs. So the next slide shows us a very tangible example. And you'll see a website link there where my colleague Beth Cobill, Chad's Grove School in Bromsgrove, and I have actually written a rationale of what is the research behind a happiness box. And for those of you who are extremely perceptive, you realise that a happiness box is nothing more than a glorified shoebox. But within that, the child puts the things that make them happy. So they can actually use those during lesson time when they get anxious to self-regulate. I love it when the child comes up and either says or signs to you, could they have their happiness box? They are realising that these can help regulate those fears and anxieties that they're experiencing. I went into our local primary school the other day to drop something off, and their entrance hall was full of shoeboxes. And on the Recovery Curriculum Facebook page, you'll find a picture of Church's shoes actually delivering shoeboxes to a special school. So every child in that school, whether they're there or still on home learning programs, could make their own happiness box. Next slide, please. And a couple of other resources. And Ian mentioned that children will need some explanation of coronavirus. Absolutely. My son found that with his student parliament. He asked them what they wanted, and they all said, we want someone to scientifically explain to them what's happened, what is this virus, what's it about. And children with special needs will want that. But of course, to put that in a written form, for some, will just be impossible. This is a wordless book, and some of you will know the Books Beyond Words series. This is a free downloadable resource from the Books Beyond Words website. And it would give you a framework to talk through the experience of coronavirus. It enables you to co-construct, co-create, co-produce the story. So good, sound pedagogical principles there. And in the next slide, I just want to flag up to you that I've been commissioned to write 2 children's books, one about lockdown and one about Lucy and Lenny returning to school. I've been able to fundraise, and the production costs for these 2 books will be covered, and they will be free as downloads and available during August, ready for the children returning to school in September. They're designed for primary age children and for those with special needs. Next slide, please. So to bring this together, can we remind ourselves, colleagues, that school is a place, education is a process, and educators are people. And teaching is a relationship-based profession. So in fact, we are just there on RSHE. We've got the R sorted. Remind yourselves, what is it that called you to be a teacher? Because ours is a vocation. And when you know that within yourself, then you'll be stronger. You will be emotionally stronger, emotionally more resilient to meet the challenges our children with special needs will bring to them as we endeavour to re-establish them into their schools and to regenerate their mental wealth. When that child comes back to you on day 1 in September, they will look into your eyes. They don't care about your fancy name label. They'll look into your eyes and they will search for the empathetic human being that lurks there. And when they find that empathetic human being, they will offer you the connection of human being to human being. You can teach and they can learn. And when they look into your eyes, may they find compassion in those eyes, because kindness is going to be absolutely key to our work, particularly in the coming term. Next slide, please. So my assessment of the new RSHE is that it offers sustainable embedded routes to recovery to our children post-pandemic. It enables us to rebuild their emotional resilience, regenerate their confidence, and move forward with hope, because, colleagues, hope is the gift of childhood. Thank you for listening today and being part of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you for that really thought-provoking presentation. I'll move straight to questions now, if I may. We will have a break, but I think we'll just have some time actually to get some questions in as well. So the first question, I work with a student who doesn't like school and is very anxious about returning. Are there any strategies that can help with this?
Some children with autism particularly have quite enjoyed the home-based learning. And I think that one of the strategies they might want to look at actually are those happiness boxes. I know my colleague Beth Coble, who's designed that piece of work with me, has used them very effectively for children who are disengaged and who are therefore home-based, and has used them as a way of supporting the child, letting them bring the happiness box into school with them just for short periods of time, initially maybe an hour at most, and maybe that hour was spent in the entrance hall. But I think something like that gives them confidence, and the happiness box, of course, would be very personalised, which again is a key tenet for our practice in the field of special needs.
Thank you. You talked about mental wealth. How important is the development of emotional language for mental wealth of children and young people? And how can we effectively evaluate their emotional understanding and expression?
It's a really good question. I think some of our children with special needs, where they have language impairments or their cognitive abilities mean that they have more restrictive language frameworks, we need to start to label emotions. And I think activities that you can do through things like Books Beyond Words enable children to begin to identify in the pictures there their own emotions. And remember that for some that may be they won't say the word perfectly, it might be a verbal approximation, it may be through a sign, it may be that they'll have to do some pointing to symbols or pictures of emotions to express themselves, or indeed for some students, voice activated devices or eye gaze technology. It's often about getting the communication medium right. It isn't that the child isn't experiencing the emotion, but because the communication can be a challenge, we've not given them the pathway, the medium through which to express and identify that in a language that is their language.
Thank you. And in terms of the delivery of RSHE and clearly having the opportunity for some schools to, well, for all schools to operate flexibility in terms of teaching RSHE, would it be appropriate, do you think, to have some extra or additional RSHE support for pupils with SEND? And how might that sort of be best delivered? And is it an opportunity to use the remaining parts of the summer to do so, or might that be something that might overwhelm parents and teachers at this time?
No, I think that's again a very good point. I do wonder, and I've been talking to some schools about, you've sent home lots of really good, high quality material. You've become very creative, I think, in using online learning. But how much of that has been about the emotional well-being of the child? There are some journals that I like that are produced by a company called Butterfly, which I'll put in the resources that will supplement this PowerPoint today. And those are really excellent in terms of exploring emotional well-being. I think many parents are starting to say how sad their children are becoming. They're still doing the online learning stuff, but the joy of learning has gone. It's been many weeks now. And really our children thrive, don't we all, on social interaction. And they have missed their friends so much. I think some of our children are going to be in a state of prolonged mourning. There's almost going to be a grief response to this period where they've had to be in lockdown. And so, for some, remember, it's actually been a shielded lockdown because they're medically compromised. They absolutely have not been able to go out of their house or the surrounds of their garden if they have a garden. So I think we've got to give space to our children when they come back to explore their emotional responses. And in many instances, there'll be an exhilarated joy on day one and in the first few weeks, but it's over time that things will start to emerge, and we need that capacity. I really hope, Rob, that RSHE will become the heart of the curriculum for our children with special needs. I'd like to say core, but I'm not going to. I'm going to say heart, because at this time, it is that kindness, it is that element of our humanity that's going to be so key to the effectiveness of our teaching. Literacy and numeracy can sit alongside, and I give them absolute credence for their importance, but RSHE should be the heart of the curriculum for children with special needs.
Thank you. Right, I think we're out of time now, unfortunately, for the questions. But thank you again for that really thought-provoking presentation, and again just for emphasising the importance of exploring relationships as we will have to as part of that delivery of the curriculum, but also in terms of the recovery of period as children and young people return back to school. We'll now go for a break. I'm going to ask colleagues if they want to have a short sort of break. So we're going to return, if I may, at 11:05. So it's a shorter break than previously advertised, but if colleagues wouldn't mind returning at that time, and we'll then continue with the event. So thank you again to both Ian and to Barry for their presentations, and we'll see you shortly in a few minutes after the break. Many thanks. Welcome back, delegates, to the Relationship, Sex and Health Education for Pupils with Special Educational Needs and Disabilities webinar. Hopefully you enjoyed the previous sessions, which were delivered by Ian and Barry. So this is another session for you, and hopefully you'll find this as equally interesting. We will start with a pre-recorded session from Rachel Baker from the Sex Education Forum. Rachel is a qualified teacher with experience of working with young people in mainstream and specialist settings. Unfortunately, Rachel can't be with us here today, but you'll see her pre-recorded session, and Lucy Emerson, the director of the Sex Education Forum, is on hand to answer questions after the presentation.
Welcome. I'm Rachel Baker. I'm Senior RSE Specialist for the Sex Education Forum. I'm a qualified teacher. I have lots of experience of working in alternate education provisions with learners with additional needs, such as behaviour and special educational needs. My most recent role in the classroom was a nurture-based tutor for a form of 16 to 19-year-old learners at a local authority secondary and sixth form for learners with additional needs. The Sex Education Forum began its work in 1987, and we've been leading policy and practice for over 30 years. We have partners and hundreds of members all over the UK. We work with many local authorities, with the Department for Education, with teaching unions and with schools. We really are at the forefront of RSE. I'm often asked, what is it that our learners with additional needs really need to cover? There's a real misconception that learners with SEND either don't need as much RSE, or perhaps they can't cope with the topics. Whilst there may be arguments for some learners having personalised or reduced curriculum, really we need to assume that all learners cover everything. It is particularly important that we teach about pornography and about masturbation and how to recognise consent and give consent, because those areas can be really problematic for parents and historically have been rather overlooked. So learners with additional needs need all the same topics as every other learner, but differentiated to cater for their cognitive ability, for their age and stage of life, for their maturity, for their experience and their social understanding. So when we then factor in how much longer it may take for learners with SEND to learn the content, we often need a lot more time for RSE in the SEND classroom than perhaps we would need in mainstream. Differentiation, this is really significant because there's a tendency to omit some topics, or even if that's not done consciously, it may be that we just run out of time if the learners need so much longer to cover the same work. But the differentiation lies in the delivery and not in the content. I would say that it doesn't matter about having written work to document the learning, but make the content accessible by using more active methods such as role play, circle time and real life examples in your discussion. For what we need to teach, refer to the by the end of primary and by the end of secondary sections of the guidance, being mindful of milestones such as beginning puberty or transitioning from lower to upper school and so on. All students in every setting and every subject will need time to revisit topics, especially if the learning they take from it will vary with their personal maturity and age at the time. But this is particularly true of learners with SEND. Overlearning really is key, and it takes the content from a one-off abstract experience to part of the day-to-day culture of the school, transforming it into a life skill rather than a learning objective. We need to shift the focus for learners with SEND in RSE so that we are supporting the learners to navigate their way through the subject of sex and relationships rather than protecting them from it. And having positive personal relationships, and when you're old enough and ready, sexual relationships, is a key part of a happy adult life for most of us. So it's vital that learners with SEND are given the skills to do that safely. By framing the learning in skills for life and adulthood, it makes the learning fit alongside the other life skills and normalises it. It's really about learning and practicing skills for life, including forming and maintaining healthy relationships and friendships, and playing a meaningful role in the community in and outside of school. It's really important that in our timetabling we give enough time for meaningful learning, including plenty of opportunities for discussion, overlearning and questions, as well as plenty of time to transition in and out of lessons. And for that reason, the position in the timetable is important too. It's no good if it falls after PE, where we might be late every time, or immediately before community access when everybody's really excited about going out on the bus. In terms of what we're teaching, I feel that in RSE for learners with SEND, the aim is to give a toolkit of skills to enable the learner to navigate the adult world with confidence and without harm, which includes consent, boundaries, understanding your emotions and those of others. RSE is really key for learners with additional needs to support them to develop their personal identity, to foster some independence and embrace our rights to have individual choices and preferences. Welcome to my classroom. This is a floor plan of my own classroom from when I was a nurture-based teacher for a class of 16 to 19-year-olds in a local SEND secondary and sixth form. I always use a differentiated seating plan, which is the same for most subjects, but I did have different seating plans for certain subjects to support group work or based on ability. Some learners work best on their own, some in pairs, some would need a dedicated TA for certain topics. Some learners really embraced moving desks, others didn't, so the plan was carefully designed to factor in all those different needs. The TAs are positioned to be able to see the learners easily and would also be moving around. The red display boards by the door contained all our class guidelines, working together agreements and so on, whereas the displays that run behind the learners and to the side were the ones that contained their work that might be more distracting while we're working. I'm always very mindful of visual clutter in the SEND classroom, and by putting the boards behind them, they could go and have a look while they were accessing equipment, or perhaps if they needed a break from their desk, but it wouldn't be there to distract them during the lesson. My desk is at the front with a view of every learner, but I would still be moving around constantly anyway. I was very fortunate to have a big enough space to have the learners bring their chairs over for a circle time, and we used that circle time at least twice a day, every day. I would say don't be afraid to move the furniture to make room for the style of learning that you have going on, because a face-to-face activity such as a circle can be really profound. My objective within my classroom was to make it a safe and familiar learning environment, and here's a bit more about how I did that. I want my classroom to be safe and familiar so that the learners feel at ease and they know what to expect. It needs to be fit for purpose, certainly big enough, but also enclosed and not where other classes will be wandering through, and a space that's conducive to the discussion nature of the subject. I want it to be well resourced. Now, whilst these may be resources I've made myself or things I've brought in, I need my tools handy. I want work on the walls to celebrate the achievement and highlight the profile of the subject. I always have clear behavioural expectations, a group working together agreement to help fashion specific behaviour expectations for RSE, which may be slightly different from the general code of behaviour in school because of the sensitive nature of the subject. It's really important that the group is familiar with one another, but if they're not, if they've been brought together for this lesson, spend some time at the beginning of the programme building the group and helping them gain that familiarity with one another. Likewise, the teacher and TA team need to be familiar to the learners, but also familiar with each other and with the subject. The TA is briefed and supportive of the aims of the lesson, and this is really important so the message is consistent. Transition time is really important for learners with additional needs, especially for learners with ASC. And the seating setup, I want everyone to be able to engage from their seat, but also it's important to have areas that a learner can move away if they feel it's a bit too much at the time, preferably without having to leave the room. Some learners may find it really hard to join a circle, but do what you can with your learners and make the setting as safe as possible for them. Familiarity is absolutely paramount, and I strongly recommend that you have a set pattern to your lessons so that learners feel secure and confident in what to expect. Transitions are fraught with issues in SEND settings, particularly if learners have to move classrooms or if they blend with different learners in your lesson to the previous one. But even if the learners stay in the same room with the same class, the emotional transition into RSE can be significant. First off, it's so important that learners know where they're going, so they go to the same room every time, and the same setup is waiting them, the same staff and the same rules. They need to get there, maybe pop to the loo on the way, arrive ready and without feeling flushed and anxious. When they arrive, we want a familiar scene, the same layout, the same teacher, the same rhythm. I always start in the circle for PSHE and RSHE. I like to start with a regular welcome activity, the same one every time. I would revisit the working together agreement to remind everyone of how we're going to work together, and then maybe do a round robin activity so you hear everyone's voice. It could be as simple as what you just had for your lunch, or maybe if you could be an animal today, what kind of animal would you be? Now, this isn't part of the learning topic, this is just a warm up. Then, when everyone's feeling comfortable, we can make the links with the learning from last lesson and take time to remember what we learned last time. Now that everyone's ready, we can introduce the new topic and talk about it in the circle, answering questions, sharing our existing understanding. And this formative assessment will help inform the pace of the rest of the lesson. Then we can break off into groups or independent work at our desks and demonstrate our understanding. Now, this doesn't have to be writing, of course. We could be doing sorting activities, talking, making little films on the class iPad, and this could be in small groups, with or without a TA, or independent work if that suits the topic in the class. And this is your main opportunity really for your formative assessment. A plenary activity is helpful to consolidate the learning, and this might just be a summing up of the message in a succinct sentence or a questioning activity, and this will form a summative assessment and will inform your planning for next lesson. Finally, a closing activity is a very useful technique to close down the lesson and support the transition, whether this is to another room and teacher, or to break time, or to a different lesson with you in the same room. It gives the signal that we're moving on and it forms a clear boundary. Then when we send them off on their way to their next lesson, again, they know where they're going, they know what to expect, and they're full of confidence. A whole school approach is really, really valuable in RSE. If we view RSE as part of skills for life in a SEND setting, then these informal opportunities are essential and add massive value. So discussions in the lunchtime queue can really embed the message from the classroom. Opportunities with parents can be really valuable too, such as annual review meetings or any opportunity to normalise discussion about RSE. This might be introducing the new parents of reception age pupils to talk about public and private and correct names for body parts when you're talking about how toileting will work in your setting, for example. Policies are extremely important too, of course, but including things like language. It's very useful to have the correct terms for body parts being used in the RSE classroom, but also in all the contexts. Even if a pupil is not verbal, there are benefits in hearing adults model this language. For example, privacy can be experienced by the pupil in how the teaching assistants support the individuals in their personal care. It can be about narrating actions. For example, I'm going to close the curtain to make this space private, or I'm helping you because I'm your key worker, or I'm cleaning your vulva or penis in private. There is a real need for training for all staff so that everybody feels really confident in embedding RSE messages. But this isn't just the teachers and the TAs, this is also your reception staff, your lunchtime supervisors, to make sure that the message is consistent and that the learning is embedded throughout the school community. If the whole school is invested in quality RSE, then it will have a massive impact on learners in the classroom and outside of the classroom. Finally, just to sum up, some top tips from me to you about how I would deliver RSE in the SEND classroom. Remembering things like a working together agreement to revisit every time, finding ways to support your learners if they find the lesson challenging, supporting them to stay in the room, creating a familiar and safe learning environment, and making sure that your resources are accessible, that people feel visible in their resources, and making sure that you have lots of time for the work and lots of time to transition in and out. If you'd like to learn more about Sex Education Forum or consider a bit more training on the subject, please do visit us at sexeducationforum.org.uk. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to thank Rachel for that presentation in her absence. And we have Lucy Emerson here today, the director of the Sex Education Forum, who is going to help us with the questions. So the technology is just pushing them through now. So the first question, if I may then, Lucy, how can you make sex education and relationships very simple for students with very low ability or understanding?
Thank you, Rob. I think the starting point is to think about the whole school approach. So everything that children are experiencing in their school life can contribute to their relationships and sex education experience. So The starting point might be something as simple as using the toilets, public and private spaces. That's part of the everyday life for children in school, and that can be reinforced through the curriculum as well. And just sticking to that really basic learning about private and public and closing the door, and being able to manage that toileting. Or if a carer is involved there, being able to support that process with language that's been agreed. So consistency of language is really helpful. Having kind of simple structure for those words that are agreed by everybody. Even if the child doesn't understand the words to start with, having that repetition and that consistency applied in the context of their lives as well as the classroom is really important. And the other key thing is just to have that time to work through it year by year by year, and not think that we can do it all in one session. And that's really a true thing for RSC, for all learners, that you've got to have a developmental approach and have adequate time for it. Looking at things about relationships, the starting point might be who is in our families. Children could have photographs to look at, even if they can't say who's in their family. They may have ways of representing who's in their family. So those are some of the ways to get started and start that process.
Thank you. We've had quite a number of questions come through about when should we teach the correct body part names, and I believe that the PSHE Association has a view, and there are some wondering whether or not it should be as early as reception year or nurseries or pre-nurseries. Would you like to comment on that?
Certainly. So echoing my previous point, consistency and repetition is going to be really important for our SEND learners. So deciding that we have these correct terms right from the outset, as children arrive in school, correct terminology for genitalia and all body parts is going to be incredibly helpful because of that opportunity for repetition and clarity of understanding. Now, schools can draw up those lists of words, explain to parents why they're using their words, explain the benefits of having consistency at home. Of course, schools can't tell parents what words to use. That's for them to decide. But the benefit of having those consistent terms for body parts will be so fundamental for safeguarding, and gives more time for children to learn those words. Plus adding the use of things like three-dimensional models so that children do know what those words really mean, and we're not just using them and assuming that there's been understanding for them. So kind of careful labelling of body parts, using models, agreeing the terms, and involving all the school staff, in fact. So it's not just for the classroom teacher to use those terms. We're thinking about people helping with first aid, lunchtime supervisors, everybody in the school knowing we're using these terms is a safeguarding thing, and we're all going to follow suit.
Thank you. And that safeguarding point being paramount, I think. So in terms of when working with young people, how important is it to be able to explore the different views that they may have, the cultural norms or the religious beliefs their families and communities may have towards sexuality and sexual relationships?
Well, culture and faith shapes the experience of our children and young people, because every family is different. And even if a family doesn't have a particular religion, they have traditions and cultures of their own, and that shapes what children bring to school with them. So if there are discussions about how families celebrate important things like marriages or birth or death, cultural dimension is going to come through in that. Also around expectations about relationships, values. Those things are held dear by families, and families will have talked to children about them, communicated them. Children will have seen and experienced those values. And there are lots of ways in which that can shine through RSE, through use of a wide range of storybooks, letting children pick and choose from the resources available to reflect their own cultural experiences. And involving families there is really important as well, because there may be cultural practices that are important to families, and if the school can listen and learn about those, it will make the RSE work more impactful and relevant for those learners.
Thank you. And linked to that engagement with parents and families, how should we proceed when speaking to parents wanting to perhaps withdraw their child owing to their beliefs that they feel that what they're learning, or what they're being taught about, maybe things they actually start to practice? The worry is that potentially they may start to take those lessons and make them practical. What's the response to that?
Sure. Well, involving parents is so important, no more so than when we're thinking of the needs of learners with special educational needs and disability, where those needs are quite individualised, and parents will know best what those needs really look like. They're dealing with those needs on a daily basis, and so close communication with school about a child's needs is going to be so important. And of course, we have an opportunity here with statutory RSHE to consult all parents, and the consulting parents of pupils with SEND must be part of that picture. After we've moved past that initial change process, what I'd hope we see in schools is a continual process of communication where parents of a child with a special educational need are arriving in the reception. It's part and parcel of their induction to learn about the RSE that's happening, to know, OK, our starting point is about public and private, it's about closing toilet doors, it's about the care of your child, it's rules for touch, it's some basic information about consent that we're going to be embedding. Helping parents see what that looks like in practice, not being afraid of it, telling them what words we're going to be using. So it really grows this partnership, and every year updating parents about what's provided. And over time, experience shows that levels of parental withdrawal will slow down after these changes are implemented, but it does require continual effort to have that engagement. And there are some particular opportunities as well with things like the annual review, the education healthcare plans, to really sit down with parents and be quite individualised about that. And not forget as well that parents will have some needs of their own. They may not have had good relationships in sex education. They may have questions they need actual education on as well. So don't be afraid to be ready to support and to do some research to support parents with resources that they may need. They may also have a special educational need and disability. But the effort pays off, because that involvement of family with school on RSE will mean more for the young person, because they'll get that consistency at home as well. So start the change process and then grow it into something that's really consistent would be my advice.
Thank you. And just, I think we've got time for one more question, and that's about how do we approach teaching sensitive topics, which the parents and the pupils may never have actually come across before, such as FGM, for example, female genital mutilation.
This takes us full circle, really, Rob, because that approach of creating that curriculum that starts in primary with having agreed terms for body parts, we're thinking about the simple messages to do with public and private, and then to do with appropriate touch and what's allowed and not allowed in your rights around your body. Having carers say what they're doing and ask permission, even if a child is not able to verbally acknowledge that, it's still the right thing to verbalise what we're doing to care for children. Those are the kind of underpinnings there of helping children to stay safe. And that work with families is also really critical, because a child by themselves isn't able to stop bad things happening, but the family as a whole can. So taking the family on that journey too, helping them be aware of the laws around FGM, being kind in that process to make sure families get help if they need it, and for them to understand their role is going to be vital. And with FGM specifically, there are some really good resources like 3D models that can be used to explain in an accessible way what happens with FGM, and for children to know that help is available. So that message about help all the way through, and knowing who those people are you can go to for help in school and out of school. It's a whole school approach really for those sensitive issues, starting right at the beginning in reception, always involving parents.
Thank you, Lucy. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in terms of questions. So again, thank you. And again, thanks to Rachel for the presentation in her absence. So I'd like to now hand over to Jenny Fox from the PSHE Association. Jenny is a senior subject specialist at the PSHE Association, leading a team of subject specialists in PSHE training, guidance and resource development. So Jenny will be talking to us about their SEND curriculum planning framework. Over to Jenny. Thank you.
Morning everyone, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm going to be talking about PSHE education through a SEND lens. As just mentioned, my name is Jenny Fox and I'm the Senior Subject Specialist at the PSHE Association. I'm also here with my colleague Karen Summers today, who has done a great deal of work on developing materials for pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, and she will be here to help answer your questions at the end of my session. So we've just got a bit of a whistle-stop tour for about 15 minutes today. We're going to be talking about the importance of PSHE education, including relationship, sex and health education for pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. We'll be talking about how the new PSHE education planning framework supports delivery of effective PSHE education in special school settings. And we'll be talking a little bit about the PSHE Association's support for PSHE leads who are working in special school settings. So just to tell you a little bit about us, if you're not familiar with the PSHE Association, we are the national body for personal, social, health and economic education across England. We are primarily a membership organisation, so we work for you, for our members, and we provide support, training and advice in various different ways, working with schools. And we also work with wider partnerships, working with government and local authorities and wider charity sector partners, all in the aim of producing high quality PSHE provision for all pupils in all settings. And so I wanted to talk to you first a little bit about our PSHE Association programme of study for PSHE education. You may already be familiar with this. Our new programme of study was launched in January 2020, and this covers our familiar 3 core themes, so health and wellbeing, relationships and living in the wider world, and it ranges from key stages 1 to 5. This has been newly updated in line with the statutory guidance and requirements around relationships and sex education and health education. So we're often asked, do these new statutory changes mean that PSHE education has become statutory? And we say, well, yes, pretty much. PSHE education is the sort of umbrella topic, umbrella subject. We see kind of 80% of the subject being made statutory by these new changes, with relationships and sex education and health education fitting under that broader umbrella of PSHE education. The one aspect that is also included in PSHE education that's not within the statutory guidance is around living in the wider world, our 3rd core theme. So that is where we are covering topics like economic well-being, preparing for careers and independent adult life, and pupils understanding their place in the wider community. So we encourage schools to think about PSHE as a whole framework, which allows them to explore relationships and sex education and health education in that wider PSHE setting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why PSHE education is so important for pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, and the particular needs relevant to those pupils. I'm sure I don't need to tell you all of this, but I think they're a helpful reminder to centre us when we're thinking about our PSHE education planning. So firstly, one of the things that we know is that pupils with special educational needs and disabilities are at a greater risk of abuse and exploitation, or of manipulation and coercion. So it's incredibly important from a safeguarding perspective that PSHE education helps to support them and to manage and to recognise those risks. Young people with special educational needs and disabilities also face certain barriers to having personal and sexual relationships. So, for example, meeting people can be more challenging, and social isolation can often be common among these pupils. Also, of course, the importance of knowing how to keep themselves safe. That's relevant for all pupils, of course, but those with special educational needs and disabilities may need particular support around aspects of keeping themselves safe, particularly as they grow and become slightly more independent towards their teenage years. And equally, in response to puberty, pupils deserve to understand what's happening to their bodies and how to deal with the changes that occur. Again, puberty is relevant to all pupils, but particularly for those with special educational needs and disabilities, their physical development may not always be in line with their cognitive development. So it's about supporting them in an age-appropriate way to recognise and understand what's happening to their bodies so that they feel secure and safe in what's happening. And of course, PSHE education can do a great deal of support in developing skills for independent adult life. So supporting those learners as they grow and as they develop towards the end of school to feel that they can lead an independent adult life, whatever that might mean for those particular pupils with their specific needs in mind. And then why is PSHE education important for schools? Well, again, a comprehensive PSHE education programme enables pupils with special educational needs and disabilities to develop the understanding, skills and attributes to lead safe and healthy lives. We are about supporting them being able to recognise how to do that for themselves. PSHE education also supports preparing for adulthood outcomes as outlined in the SEND Code of Practice. PSHE education, of course, underpins the implementation of statutory relationships and sex education and health education, so allows schools to meet their statutory duties in that way. And it supports the development of key communication skills, vocabulary, strategies and confidence to help manage issues when they encounter them. Those are the kind of transferable skills that are relevant across the curriculum, but PSHE is the space where pupils have the opportunity to develop those and to rehearse and practice the skills they need for later life. So I wanted to highlight some of the planning tools that are already available and that you may already be familiar with. So I've already mentioned our programme of study for Key Stages 1 to 5. This outlines all of the learning opportunities that a school could possibly cover in PSHE education in those 3 core themes: health and wellbeing, relationships and living in the wider world. Our members can also access our programme builders, which help to outline learning for each year group and in each half term. It's quite hard to see this small map here, but this gives you a kind of curriculum overview, which lays out the different core themes colour-coded for different half terms. There are 5 different models of our programme builders that you can use and develop, and which many schools have already been taking and using to create their PSHE curriculum. But one thing that we were very aware of when we created these is that there was nothing specific for schools working in special educational settings or particularly targeted at pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. So that is why we are very delighted to today be launching our planning framework for pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. This is the only comprehensive PSHE progressive spiral framework for Key Stages 1 to 4. Our new version of this planning framework covers all aspects of the statutory relationships, sex and health education guidance in a way that makes the learning accessible for pupils with SEND. And it also goes above and beyond the statutory guidance, so again includes those important topics from core theme 3, where we're looking at economic wellbeing, personal safety, careers and preparing for adulthood. The planning framework also enables schools to plan a bespoke PSHE programme for pupils with varying needs. So this can be used really flexibly for your setting, thinking about what the needs of your pupils currently are and where you can meet those in the framework. It helps to identify priority objectives across the school as well as for individual pupils. So this can very much be a bespoke personal one-on-one tool for individual pupils or for a whole year group or for a whole class. It provides structure and guidance on how to break down topics across the key stages. There is also a section at the back of the framework which gives specific guidance and support about how to assess learning in PSHE education with particular reference to the planning framework and the learning opportunities that are identified there. And it's also flexible so that it can be adapted for use alongside chosen accreditation routes, for example, if your school is following courses such as ASDAN. In terms of how we developed this planning framework, some of you may already be familiar with some of the earlier stages. So firstly, we were lucky enough to work with PSHE leads in special educational settings and to hear the kind of struggles they were having, challenges they were having around planning their PSHE curriculum, some of the issues that were arising for them and for their pupils. So working with that group of small PSHE leads in that focused way helped us to think about what needed to be included in the planning framework. The project has also been supported by NASON, the National Association for Special Educational Needs, and so we are delighted and very grateful to them for all of the support and guidance they've given us through the development of this planning framework. And it's also been piloted in special educational settings, and we've heard fantastic feedback from PSHE leads and teachers who've been using the framework in a variety of different ways to help meet the needs of their learners and to help plan very bespoke PSHE curricula for their pupils. So the first edition of the SEND planning framework actually launched in 2018. So again, some of you may already be familiar with this and have been starting to use it. And if so, that's fantastic. But today is the day that we launch our second edition. And we're very excited about this because this is a newly updated version of the framework, which is in line with the 2020 programme of study, which I've mentioned previously, and also in line with the DFE statutory guidance. So you can rest assured that it's covering all of the statutory content for relationships and sex education and health education. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how the planning framework is broken down. So the format of it is covering these 6 main topic areas. So self-awareness, self-care, support and safety, managing feelings, changing and growing, healthy lifestyles, and the world I live in. So what these do is take a lot of the relationships aspects, relationships and sex education aspects, and weave them throughout the framework, starting with self-awareness and that understanding of who am I and how do I relate to others. Lots of the aspects around safe relationships are included in self-care, support and safety. Lots of those learning around developing relationships with others, whether those be friendships or in managing and responding to bullying, or whether it be intimate and personal relationships, are included within the managing feelings theme. And then, as we can see, changing and growing allows pupils to understand aspects such as puberty, for example. So within these 6 core themes, they are also, all the learning opportunities are then broken down into progressive stages across these 6 stages that you can see along the bottom here. So starting with encountering, where pupils are just beginning to engage in the learning process effectively, looking at foundational or underpinning learning, their core learning, the sort of fundamental thing that we want pupils to be understanding from this learning outcome, and then gradually working through development, enrichment and enhancement. And if you do have pupils who are working towards enhancement and who are kind of at that stage, then that's likely they can also start to use some of the learning opportunities and outcomes from our programme of study, which is designed for all settings. So this can be very much a developmental framework where pupils work through each of these 6 stages as they become more confident learners. But it might also be that you have pupils who are stay within one stage and are able to look at each of those core themes through using the core learning outcomes, for example. So I just wanted to show you a couple of examples of what those look like. Again, they are quite small, so I'll try to read them out for you. This is an example from Changing and Growing in Key Stage 1 and 2 at the top here. So in Encountering, for example, we have respond with curiosity to prompting about babies, what they look like and how they behave, and how we have changed since we were a baby. Moving through, for example, to Core, where describe how our needs have changed since we were a baby. Moving towards Enrichment, where we're identifying stages of the human life cycle. And then Enhancement, explain how the needs of babies, children and adults and older people differ. So you can see a real gradual progression there through each of the 6 stages, exploring that concept of changing and growing, and particularly thinking about the human life cycle. An example from Healthy Lifestyles here for Key Stage 3 and 4, focusing around food choices. So again, starts with responding to stimuli about different kinds of food and drinks. Moves up gradually to identify our favourite foods and drinks, and then describe different foods and drinks and give reasons for our choices. And then by the time we're moving towards enrichment and enhancement, we can describe some of the long-term benefits of a healthy diet, or explain some of the influences on our food choices and strategies for managing these influences. So again, as you can see, a real gradual progression there through Key Stage 3 to 4 learning opportunities in healthy lifestyles. And to finish, I just wanted to highlight some of the PSHE Association support that's available to our members or to PSHE leads. So firstly, members can contact us at any time via email with specific questions about support for their planning. We also have online one-to-one consultations which we're running at the moment that anybody is welcome to sign up for. And we have CPD events which are specifically for PSHE provision in special educational needs settings. We are very excited to not just be launching the framework today, but we'll also be launching our Send Hub on the PSHE Association website. This is dedicated to the needs of PSHE teachers working in special school settings. It's currently in its development, so at the moment it has on there the planning framework for pupils with SEND, which I've just been talking to you about, and also some FAQs around the SEND framework and how it can be used differently in different settings. We are also hoping to be adding very soon some case studies which highlight good practice in special educational settings, examples of some pupils' work from teachers who have been using the planning framework, and there'll be news updates coming regularly. We do hope in the future, although this is quite a long-term project at the moment, that we will be gradually adding more and more quality assured resources which are also relevant to special educational needs settings. So do keep your eye out and keep revisiting the hub for ideas and materials. So just to finish, thank you very much for listening. The website is pshe-association.org.uk, and to access our Send Hub, that's just kind of / and then send on the end, and that will take you directly to our planning framework and our FAQs and the other materials as we begin to upload them. So thanks very much for listening, and then myself and Karen will be here to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, and welcome, Karen, for the question sessions. And I should add my congratulations, of course, for the launch of the planning framework today as well. So just letting the technology run through, and then I will take you through some of the questions which have come up. So the first question, in Key Stage 1, is naming the external genitalia covered in the science curriculum, and can you adapt plans from the PSHE Association as they are currently in PDF? So I think that's a technical question as well as a content question.
Thank you, Rob. Well, as you know, the PSHE Association is very keen that children know the names of body parts, and we recommend that happens in Year 1. But I appreciate the context is wider with children and young people with special educational needs. So really it's all about, as Lucy alluded to, keeping young people safe and supporting that move to independence. So I would suggest that it's very much a partnership work with parents, as well as it being a school decision, but it definitely taps into that, supporting that child, young person towards keeping themselves safe, as well as that move towards growing independence. Our framework that we just launched today, that we're so excited about, very much that can be adapted and used in a very flexible way to support the different needs and abilities of children with special educational needs. So as Jenny mentioned, it covers 6 stages, so that encountering and foundation, those early stages where we've got learning opportunities under topics for all learners. They again can be used for learners to incorporate that wider understanding around whether it's naming body parts, understanding body changes and so on. And that cuts across both the primary and the secondary framework editions, so that if you have a learner who is potentially is Key Stage 4 age group, but maybe due to cognitive abilities is possibly functioning at more of the primary end, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2. We've ensured that the framework can be moved, adapted, and things moved around so that that young person's needs can be addressed, so that you can discuss puberty, naming of body parts, etc., etc.
Thank you.
And can I just jump in very quickly, sorry to say, if you are using our programme builders, which I mentioned earlier, they are available in Word document form as well as PDF, so they very much can be adapted and developed by schools to work for you and for your curriculum. We recognise there is no such thing as a perfect one-size-fits-all PSHE curriculum. It very much needs to be tailored to the needs of your community. So they are, yes, available in Word document form as well as PDF so that you can make those changes. Thank you. asking.
Definitely. Thank you, Jenny. And as well, just to reiterate, that the new framework is also available in Word, and again that can be adapted and used, and it is free to everybody, not just to members, but we are intending to provide additional resources for our and they will be member only. But again, it can be played around with, adapted, used, so that you are creating that truly progressive spiral PSHE curriculum that is truly matched to the needs of all learners, particularly the needs of children with special needs and additional needs.
That's really helpful to know. Thank you, Karen, for that. And just sort of linking to sort of particular issues then. So in terms of teaching the new statutory relationship, sex and health education, how best can we make reasonable adjustments for pupils with, for example, severe autism?
Well, first of all, our new framework has been completely cross-referenced and mapped against the statutory guidance, and that's in Appendix 2 for anyone using the document. So you can see quite clearly where the learning opportunities are linked with the topics that are in the statutory guidance. And looking at the framework, as Jenny has outlined, those early stages, encountering, foundation, core, they can be used and adapted to make a bespoke curriculum for those young people and to make those adjustments that are needed. They can also be used as well to support priorities in EHC plans as well as IEP targets, and to reiterate that the framework can be used in both mainstream and special school and additional settings. So it may be the case that colleagues working in mainstream settings have young people, children in their class who need slightly more tailored support and can't access that mainstream provision. Then the framework can be used. It is also being cross-referenced with our programme of study, which it is based on, in Appendix 1. So colleagues can just look to see what they're using in the programme of study and cross-reference that with our planning framework. And that can support small group provision as well as individual one-to-one provision.
Thank you. And just a sort of supplementary to that, so in terms of finding both age-appropriate and developmentally sensitive Key Stage 3 and 4 materials, it's been sort of described as being quite a task. So, and often resources that are available contain graphics that may appear to be quite immature. So can you recommend where you might be able to find resources that are appropriate, both in terms of age and developmental awareness for SEND students and pupils?
It's a growing area, I would say, and you're quite right, Rob. In the dim and distant past and currently, colleagues working in special schools often have to adapt resources that are out there. But I would signpost colleagues to organisations like the Autism Trust and the British Institute of Learning Difficulties, organisations like Books Beyond Words, Down Syndrome's Association as well, and in recent times Brooke and the RNID have come together to create videos to support young people who are hearing impaired. There are many resources out there, and I suspect that with the statutory guidance being coming out in September and being implemented, that there'll be even more resources that we can signpost colleagues to. And as Jenny said, we have our SEND hub, and on that hub we will also be signposting members to additional resources, and hopefully we'll be adding more of our own to that part of the website. Thank you. That's really helpful.
I think it's perhaps worth saying that we quality assure resources from other organisations. So there are a wealth of resources available on the PSHE Association website. Those are mostly at the moment tailored towards mainstream settings, although we do, as one of our requirements around quality assurance is that they can be suitably differentiated, so that there are suggestions to support pupils to access the learning and also to kind of extend learning and provide challenge at the other end. So it might be that some of those materials that, although designed for a mainstream setting, are suitable or can be quite easily adapted for use in special educational settings or with particular pupils with learning needs as well.
Yeah, and as Jenny said, there's a growing awareness out there of organisations. Recently, Barclays, we QA'd some lessons for them, and they have contributed that with creating bespoke lessons for learners with SEND, and within differentiation of lessons within mainstream, we very much in our new QA standards very much encourage that approach. So I think that will be a thing to watch, that there will be much more awareness and resources for members to access out there.
We often talk about age appropriateness in terms of resources, but clearly there is that other aspect of developmental sensitivity in terms of where pupils are in terms of their cognitive development. So a question's come in: should I allow SEND pupils to watch the same resources, RSHE videos, for example, that their non-SEND peers would also watch, or how can I manage the developmental sensitivities around that?
Just to echo some of the things that Lucy has said, again, it's very much working in partnership with parents, as well as schools and the teacher concerned, understanding and being well tuned to the particular needs of those learners. Mm-hmm. In some cases, it might be appropriate. In other cases, it might be that more pictorial, things like books beyond words might be used, or some of the Sheffield NHS Trust materials might be useful. Again, it would be really on a bespoke and situation by situation. It wouldn't be appropriate to give a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to that. And again, it would depend on the nature of the video and what's included, etc. But some kind of differentiation obviously would be needed depending on that young person's cognitive abilities, etc.
And of course, as that young person's needs change, of course, then the needs of the access to the resources may also change. So I guess that would need to be part of the planning for those individuals.
Yes, very much so. Within our framework, topics and themes such as relationships, puberty, keeping safe and so on, cuts across both primary and secondary, so that sometimes there may be the situation where you have a student operating, as I say, sort of in Key Stage 4, who might be quite well versed in using lots of social media, but maybe operating at a developmental and cognitive level more towards sort of Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2. So hopefully our framework has included learning opportunities across those 6 stages to enable a kind of bespoke and matched to needs PSHE curriculum that will support that learner.
Thank you. And my thanks to both Jenny and Karen for the presentation and the informative responses to the questions as well. So I'm afraid we're sort of running out of time now, so we don't have time for any further questions, but I hope that the delegates who've attended today have found both the presentations, the speakers, and the information provided both informative and useful. We want to continue to embed SEND throughout RSHE delivery and to work with colleagues who have attended today, but also more broadly. So please do fill in the evaluation form to let us know what you thought of today and how you would like to be supported going forward. The materials will be available after this presentation. We do have an evaluation form, as I mentioned, so please do feel free to fill that in. We are hoping to continue in terms of our thinking around SEND specific events, working with colleagues attending today and others. So I'd just like to thank the speakers who've attended today, and thank you again for those questions that have come in. I think that it was really helpful to keep that momentum of the discussion going, but also to thank you for being part of today. Clearly the department does have a strong interest in getting SEND right through RSHE delivery, and your support to enable us to do that is also very welcome. So I'd just like to say enjoy the rest of the day and thank you for attending.